Hey class, Mr. G here. Today we're going over the drying aspects of clay, how clay dries out, and what you guys need to know about it. Okay class, so today we're going to be talking about how clay dries out, why we need to know about how clay dries out, because that does affect processes in the way that clay, and things that we need to know. Like our kids are going to ask us all the time. I know, get asked, will my clay be dried out the next day of class? Will my clay be dried out too much to work with by the next day of class? So these are the tips and tricks that I've got for you guys to make sure that your clay works the best. So starting us off, let's talk about clay itself. Now, I was at the National Education Conference in Boston this year for 2019. I ran into somebody who works at Amico. So she was telling me about the way that they work with clay, and the way that she works in her studio is they got rid of the clay bags, the bags that the clay comes in. As soon as the clay comes to the shop, they get rid of the bag. And I'm like, what do you do? Big old Tupperware container, puts the clay in it, takes the bag, throws those in the trash. I think that is a brilliant idea. I am working on that myself, trying to get enough Tupperware containers for my students in my class so that we can do that. Right now we're still working with the bag. The reason that she gets rid of the bags, and this is what I agree with her 100% on, is that inside of each bag you're going to have clay bits, the little bits that are just stuck to the plastic as the fresh clay comes out of it. During time, that stuff's going to dry out, and that clay then is going to turn into dust. It's going to be particles. It's going to be suspended in the air. You're breathing that in. Not safe, not friendly, not helpful. So getting rid of that clay dust, those clay bags, is a great thing. But that does change as we start going into how do we keep our clay from drying out, because we're not going to have our wares inside of Rubbermaid containers or Tupperware containers. We're not going to have our wares inside of plastic containers. So what we need to do is we need to find another avenue of how to keep the moisture inside the clay as long as possible. All right, a fresh piece of clay, fresh out of the bag, it's going to have that nice, wet, damp feeling to it, and you're going to know that this is fresh clay that you can work with. Now, as the process goes on, the three drying stages that we primarily deal with are fresh clay, which is straight out of the bag, fresh out of a pug mill, good and squishy, cold, to leather hard. Leather hard is that slightly dried out. It is good for sizing, scoring. If you're dealing slab pieces, it's the best time to build it when you're dealing with leather hard clay. It's going to be cool to the touch, and it's going to be slightly darker color than this. If you're using a low fire B mix, that is, all clays are going to look a little different in the drying stages. Then you have the bone dry clay, which is the most fragile. All the physical water is pretty much dried out of the clay, and it's not taken out completely, but at that stage you can't really work with it anymore. You can't add to the piece, you can't use slip. It's really just that at that stage, straight into the kiln box, straight into your kiln, fire it off and be done with it. While it's in the fresh stage, we're trying to work with it, we want to be working with the clay as much as possible, with as much information that we have as possible. When we're working with our clay, we want to be able to look at the weather maps, and we want to be able to check out what weather is and how weather affects our clay. I'm in the South. We have a lot of humidity here. There's a lot of humidity, and the humidity helps us a lot with the clay because it keeps the clay moist longer. However, at the same token, it's really warm down here, so the clay does dry out. So it's like we have moisture in the air, but it's warm out, so the clay is slowly drying, but there's moisture in the air, so it doesn't dry as rapidly. Whereas if you're in a more drier climate, there's not as much moisture in the air, so the moisture is going to be pulled out of the clay faster, even though it's not as hot. So those are things that you need to be aware of, because you need to be aware of the temperature, you need to be aware of humidity. Barometric pressure sometimes comes into play, because then it can tell if there's going to be a rainstorm coming. These are all variables that you need to know when you're working with clay. Now, one of my professors said that if I knew everything about the weather for the next 2 weeks, I could tell you exactly what you need to know. Luckily, we live in a day and time where you can find most of that information out, and it keeps you relatively aware of what you need to know so that you can make sure that your clay works as long as possible and to get the best amount of work out of your clay as possible. All right, so for me, I got my pilot's license, so I have to know about weather maps a lot more, and that helps me tell my students what we need to know. So I can easily pull up a map on my phone. I can pull up the weather app. I can pull up a map of local airports, which also has fantastic weather tracking technology. So if you have your pilot's license, it's a lot easier to read because it's all in military code. Once you understand what that stuff says, then trying to figure out how the incoming weather is going to affect clay is a lot easier to predict. Now for me, when I'm working with clay, these are the things that I look for in the general sense of what's going to make the clay work as best as possible. Number one, what's the temperature outside? Is it going to be really hot? That right there, till I go ahead in the classroom, I take the thermostat, kick the thermostat all the way down as cool as possible. And I usually keep it cold in here. One, I'm a hot-blooded person, so cold actually works really well for me. Two, the clay itself works better as it's colder, because the temperature of your skin, if your skin is a slightly colder, it's not that 98.6 degrees, the heat from your skin is not going to be pulling moisture out of the clay as rapidly as possible either. So my students complain that it's cold in here all the time, and it's cold in here for a couple reasons. One, it's more comfortable for me. Two, so that the clay stays fresher longer. So that's the main reason. All right, now so the next thing, so after temperature we got humidity in the air. How much moisture is in the air? That is a very important thing to know, because that's going to make sure that we keep the moisture in the clay as long as possible. So usually when you're looking at a map of weather on the stats here, you'll have a dew point. So the dew point is the lowest temperature to where water droplets actually start to form and create dew. Humidity, dew point, these things play a huge role into how quickly our clay dries out. Now, humidity, if you have high humidity in your area, it means you have a lot of moisture, a lot of water vapor inside of the air. That's going to create a better environment for the clay. The clay is going to be much more moist longer. It's going to stay wet longer, which is good. It's going to stay fresh longer, so you can work with it longer. As I keep saying, humidity, good. It keeps them susceptible. Dew point is another factor. The dew point is the temperature at which dew can actually start to form. So if you have a low dew point, that means that the humidity is going to be less in the air, and it's going to take a lot more factors to create water vapor inside of that environment. And so that clay now becomes a sponge that's just drying out in the open air. And the air is going to be pulling moisture off of that clay, and as it does that, your clay is drying out faster, and there's a lot more factors that are going to make it work not as smoothly as it could if you had other factors. If you have a humidifier in your room and you can create more water vapor, more kind of like a tropical environment, is if you keep it cool but you have water vapor in the air, the clay is going to stay freshest longest. So cool environment, lots of water in the air, clay's not going to be I'm trying to think of an example for this. I love Harry Potter, so one of the best examples are the clay is basically like one of the students from the school, and then the atmosphere basically works like a Dementor. It comes by, it sucks the moisture out of the clay, and it creates dries it up, kills the clay a lot faster. That's one of those things where if you know the weather, you know how things are going to work, your clay stays better longer, and it works a lot better in the overall. Finally, the last thing that everybody's like, oh, how do we keep this, store this, make this work the best possible, is how do we store clay so that we can make sure the clay stays fresh from one class to the next. So one of the big things that I use in my class are, we do have the plastic bags that we use to store the clay by, but we also use saran wrap. You can use wet paper towels, you can use spray bottles to create moisture and create a moisture rich environment for your clay to live in. Remember, hot air rises, so if you have high shelves that you're storing the clay on, and sometimes you'll come in the next day and there's a lot of like dew and condensation on the outside of the bags because there's so much hot air up there that it's creating its own environment inside the bag. Now sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, depending on what your take is on, is mold bad? That would factor in. So keeping clay low to the ground so that it stays moist longer, that's what I usually recommend. For my students, when we're working, if we have a long extended weekend, I tell them to really wrap their pieces up well. I keep the thermostat on as low as possible. I try and mitigate any air that's moving around the room, so then the room is cold. The room is kind of a controlled climate element to where there's not too much moisture. I've got water buckets around the room, so I can always tell if those are decreased a lot over one of those long extended periods of time, then the room was really dry, so a lot more moisture got pulled out. Because the buckets are around the room, the buckets are being pulled out first before the clay is touched. So most of the time, kids that have their pieces wrapped up nicely in bags, the atmosphere didn't affect them, and that keeps a product or piece still together to where they can continue to work on the next class. If you're storing otherwise, there's a couple of techniques that I do. If one of my students is working on a piece of clay, they got clay here, they can spray it with a spray bottle, then put that into a bag. Again, you're creating extra moisture to make sure that the moisture stays in the clay, and the outside elements, the water vapor that's on the outside, that's what dries off, not the stuff inside the clay. That's how we do that. Some teachers also have their students wrap wet paper towels around the clay to keep it moist as long as possible. Again, wrap it in a bag. My students, sometimes I tell them double bag, so they bag up one, put another bag over the top to create that locked atmosphere, so that clay isn't dried out any faster. Another way that we do, if we need to overnight one night from a Wednesday into a Thursday, and I need the clay to be slightly dried out so they can start working on the carving or the building of slabs, I'll have the pieces put into a bag. And when they put them into a bag, nice flat bag, pieces inside of it, and then I'll have them slightly compress but not tuck the end of the paper, the plastic here, so that air creates a circulation around the piece, so it slowly dries it out. Again, temperature is low in the room, the pieces are low to the ground, the amount of air that's circulating around is minimal, so there is a slow dry process to this to ensure that the clay does not completely dry out, bone dry state, but comes into a nice leather hard state. Or sometimes if it's a larger piece that it's not flat, just draping plastic over the top of it to where you have little pockets of air that can kind of get underneath and slowly dry out the piece at the same time. That creates that proper leather hard clay that we want for the next class as well. So lots of tips here to create that perfect atmosphere that creates that more workable environment to make your pieces work a lot better, have your students' pieces work a lot better. As always, don't forget to do your homework, which is like, subscribe, share, and all the various platforms. Continue the community, make it grow, do wonderful things here with education. If you have a question, concern, or anything else, raise your hand down in the comments below. Happy to answer those questions about your stuff. If you have a tip on something else that I didn't cover, but you know that works really well, toss it down in the comments. Make this thing an ongoing conversation. As always, I will see you guys in next class. Until then, later, guys. Before so the